man and the battle of life. Thus, if we are to appreciate in its catholicity,
Catholic.
catholicity, the teaching of the Gita, um, we must accept intellectually its standpoint and courageous envisaging of the manifest nature and process of the world. Okay? So we have to appreciate its Catholic teaching. Catholicity here means, it uses, yeah. We must accept intellectually its standpoint and courageous envisaging of the manifest nature and process of the world. And what is that? The divine charioteer of Kurukshetra reveals himself on one side as the Lord of all the worlds and the friend and omniscient guide of all creatures, on the other as time the destroyer, arisen for the destruction of these peoples. So, this is was extremely important. The divine charioteer of Kurukshetra, Sri Krishna, reveals himself as on one side as the Lord of all the worlds and friend and omniscient guide of all creatures, and on the other side as time the destroyer, arisen for the destruction of these peoples. The Gita, following in this the spirit of the Catholic Hindu religion, affirms this also as God. It does not attempt to evade the enigma of the world by escaping from it through a side door. If, in fact, we do not regard existence merely as the mechanic action of a brute and indifferent material force, or, on the other hand, as an equally mechanical play of ideas and energies arising out of an original non-existence, or else reflected in the passive soul, or the evolution of a dream or nightmare in the surface consciousness of an indifferent, immutable transcendence, which is unaffected by the dream and has no real part in it, if we accept at all, as the Gita accepts, the existence of God, that is to say, of the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, yet always transcendent being, who manifests the world and himself in the world, who is not the slave but the lord of his creative consciousness, nature or force, Maya, Prakriti or Shakti, who is not baffled or thwarted in his world conception or design by his creatures, man or devil, who does not need to justify himself by shifting the responsibility of any part of his creation or manifestation on that which is created or manifested, then the human being has to start from a difficult act of faith. Finding himself in a world which is apparently a chaos of battling powers, a clash of vast and obscure forces, a life which subsists only by constant change and death, menaced from every side by pain, suffering, evil, and destruction. He has to see the omnipotent deity in it all. And that's where the great act of faith comes in. To see the omnipotent deity in it all, and conscious that of this enigma there must be a solution, and beyond this ignorance in which he dwells, a knowledge that reconciles. He has to take his stand upon this faith. Though thou slay me, yet will I trust in thee. All human thought of faith that is active and affirmative, whether it be theistic, pantheistic, or atheistic, does in fact involve, more or less explicitly and completely, such an attitude. It admits and it believes, admits the discords of the world, believes in some highest principle of God, universal being, or nature, which shall enable us to transcend, overcome, or harmonize these discords, even to do all three at once: transcend, overcome, and harmonize. To harmonize by overcoming and transcending. Then, as to human life and its actualities, we have to accept its aspect of a struggle and a battle mounting into supreme crisis, such as that of Kurukshetra. Of course, we can see right now in front of us, in present time, these terrible war between Ukraine and Russia, between um, Israel and Gaza and Hamas and so on. Yeah, these, wherever we go, and of course to a smaller extent in our the skirmishes and wars in our own neighborhoods and nations and societies. So obviously, this man in the battle of life, I mean, that is why he wrote this chapter of Kurukshetra. And this is a continuation of this chapter that we are now studying, where he is saying that God is not just the God, the friend, the guide, and but God is also, the divine is also time, the destroyer, the destruction of peoples, and and to get that complete sense of the Godhead of this universe and the divinity in this universe, one has to take a leap of faith. One has to stand upon faith, because if one does not have faith, one can very easily become extremely disturbed and extremely, what should I say, uh, you know, can lose one's bearings and one's moorings, and that's how people fall into depression and suicide and so on. So, you know, it's a very, very, I think it's a what he, what the Gita is. That's why it's such a great scripture and such a great book, because if you look at what it's unraveling to us. So we can read this ourselves next time. I'm going to stop here. Crying and wanting to future in his friend. Yes, yes. So we, we feel bad and we want to get over it. Can't comprehend that he will. But if I'm not saying because it's not happened, don't consider it happens to the others, but they're like martyrs because they kind of instigate the whole society to come out and become aware and get, and somewhere down the line with layers and with levels, people have started changing and becoming more aware of how we need to change the society or the consciousness. So it's very slow in so one cannot condone any of this. Yes, that's the first message. And if you read Kurukshetra, Sri Aurobindo is very clear. No tamasic response or reaction to these things. No moral high ground, no passivity. Yet, on the other hand, one can see it clearly for what it is, and then decide on what path we want to take. I think the important thing here is to be able to keep one's equanimity and one's faith in the terrible battle and crisis of life. Whether one reads the newspapers, whatever it is, the equanimity and the faith that there is that, but however, not to condone and not to become insensitive either. Mhm. So these are all, that's why I say it's so layered, it's so nuanced, it's so, amoral, it's so, yeah, it's different, it's you hold contradictions, and yet you are, um, you know, you're aware of that, you're aware of the fact that, and yet you see yourself sometimes falling into despair, don't you? When you don't have a solution. And that's when the Gita comes. And you hear and you see, yes, there is time to destroy it. Maybe I don't know what is the best. And maybe I'm not the right one to judge. And maybe I have not the mind or the moral compass to be able to do so. Anyway, these are ideas and thoughts. Mhm. Very good evening, a good day to our friends. Um, Today we begin chapter 6, Man and the Battle of Life. And I want to start with the last few lines of chapter 4. We must acknowledge Kurukshetra. We must submit to the law of life by death before we can find our way to the life immortal. We must open our eyes with a less appalled gaze than Arjuna's to the vision of our Lord of time and death, and cease to deny, hate, or recoil from the universal destroyer. Lord of time and death. Man and the Battle of Life, chapter 4. Chapter 5. Sorry, chapter 6, I would say. Man and the Battle of Life, chapter 6. Thus, if we are to appreciate in its Catholicity the teaching of the Gita, we must accept intellectually its standpoint and courageous envisaging of the manifest nature and process of the world. The divine charioteer of Kurukshetra reveals himself on one side as the Lord of all the worlds and the friend and omniscient guide of all creatures. Yes. On the other, as time the destroyer, arisen for the destruction of these peoples. The Gita, following in this the spirit of the Catholic Hindu religion, affirms this also as God. It does not attempt to evade the enigma of the world by escaping from it through a side door. If, in fact, we do not regard existence merely as the mechanic action of a brute and indifferent material force, or, on the other hand, as an equally mechanical play of ideas and energies arising out of an original non existence, or else reflected in the passive soul, or the evolution of a dream or nightmare in the surface consciousness of an indifferent, immutable transcendence, which is unaffected by the dream and has no real part in it. If we accept at all, as the Gita accepts, the existence of God, that is to say, of the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, yet always transcendent being, who manifests the world and himself in the world, who is not the slave, but the Lord of his creative consciousness, nature or force, Maya, Prakriti or Shakti, who is not baffled or thwarted in his world conception or designed by his creatures, man or devil, who does not need to justify himself by shifting the responsibility for any part of his creation or manifestation on that which is created or manifested, then the human being has to start from a difficult act of faith, finding himself in a world which is apparently a chaos of battling powers, a clash of vast and obscure forces, a life which subsists only by constant change and death, menaced from every side by pain, suffering, evil, and destruction. He has to see the omnipresent deity in it all, and conscious that of all this enigma, there must be a solution, and beyond this ignorance in which he dwells, a knowledge that reconciles. He has to take his stand upon this faith. Though thou slay me, yet will I trust in thee. All human thought or faith that is active and affirmative, whether it be theistic, pantheistic, or atheistic, does in fact involve, more or less explicitly and completely, such an attitude. It admits and it believes, admits the discords of the world, believes in some highest principle of God, universal being or nature, which shall enable us to transcend, overcome, or harmonize these discords, perhaps even to do all three at once, to harmonize by overcoming and transcending. I think we read this last time, did we not? Yes. Then, as to human life in its actualities, we have to accept its aspect of a struggle and a battle mounting into supreme crisis, such as that of Kurukshetra. The Gita, as we have seen, takes for its frame such a period of transition and crisis as humanity periodically experiences in its history, in which great forces clash together for a huge destruction and reconstruction, intellectual, social, moral, religious, political, and these, in the actual psychological and social stage of human evolution, culminate usually through a violent physical convulsion of strife, war, or revolution. The Gita proceeds from the acceptance of the necessity in nature for such vehement crisis, and it accepts not only the moral aspect, the struggle between righteousness and unrighteousness, between the self affirming law of good and the forces that oppose its progression, but also the physical aspect, the actual armed war or other vehement physical strife between the human beings who represent the antagonistic powers. We must remember that the Gita was composed at a time when war was even more than it is now a necessary part of human activity. And the idea of its elimination from the scheme of life would have been an absolute chimera. The gospel of universal peace and goodwill among men, for without a universal and entire mutual goodwill, there can be no real and abiding peace, has never succeeded for a moment in possessing itself of human life during the historic cycle of our progress. Because morally, socially, spiritually, the race was not prepared and the poise of nature in its evolution would not admit of its being immediately prepared for any such transcendence. Even now, we have not actually progressed beyond the feasibility of a system of accommodation between conflicting interests, which may minimize the recurrence of the worst forms of strife. And towards this consummation, the method, the approach, which humanity has been forced by its own nature to adopt, is a monstrous, mutual massacre unparalleled in history. A universal war full of bitterness and irreconcilable hatred is the straight way and the triumphant means modern man has found for the establishment of universal peace. That consummation, too, founded not upon any fundamental change in human nature, but upon intellectual notions, economic convenience, vital and sentimental shrinkings from the loss of life, discomfort and horror of war, effected by nothing better than political adjustments, gives no very certain promise of firm foundation and long duration. A day may come, must surely come, we will say, when humanity will be ready spiritually, morally, socially, for the reign of universal peace. Meanwhile, the aspect of battle and the nature and function of man as a fighter have to be accepted and accounted for by any practical philosophy and religion. The Gita, taking life as it is, and not only as it may be in some distant future, puts the question how this aspect and function of life, which is really an aspect and function of human activity in general, can be harmonized with the spiritual existence. So, this is the question that the Gita puts forward, that how, because it takes life as it is and not as it should be. It's not an idyllic philosophy or a spirituality divorced from life. The Gita is a very practical way method of spirituality, and therefore it puts the question how this aspect and function of life, which is really an aspect and function of human activity, can be harmonized with the spiritual existence. Now, of course, we are reading this chapter at a very important and significant moment in the history of our own times, and in present times, the war that has just erupted, fortunately, um, has not gone into a full blown uh, affair as it could have, but certainly, I'm sure all of us have reflected upon some of the principles we have read in these chapters and how close they are to us even today in our present reality. So before I continue, any questions or comments in the 2 pages that I read? The Gita is therefore addressed to a fighter, a man of action, one whose duty in life is that of war and protection. War as a part of government for the protection of those who are excused from that duty, debarred from protecting themselves, and therefore at the mercy of the strong and the violent. War, secondly, and by a moral extension of this idea, for the protection of the weak and the oppressed, for the maintenance of right and justice in the world. For all these ideas, the social and the practical, the moral and the chivalrous, enter into the Indian conception of the Kshatriya, the man who is a warrior and ruler by function, and a knight and a king in his nature. Although the more general and universal ideas of the Gita are those which are the most important to us, we ought not to leave out of consideration altogether the coloring and trend they take from the peculiar Indian culture and social system in the midst of which they arose. That system differed from the modern in its conception. To the modern mind, man is a thinker, worker, or producer, and a fighter all in one. Now, this is important because of the Varna system as opposed to the way that we think of man. To the modern mind, man is a thinker, worker, or producer, and fighter all in one. And the tendency of the social system is to lump all these activities and to demand from each individual his contribution to the intellectual, economical, and military life and needs of the community without paying any heed to the demands of his individual nature and temperament. The ancient Indian civilization laid peculiar stress on the individual nature, tendency, temperament, and sought to determine by it the ethical type, function, and place in the society. Nor did it consider man primarily as a social being or the fullness of his social existence as the highest ideal, but rather as a spiritual being in process of formation and development, and his social life, ethical law, play of temperament, and exercise of function as means and stages of spiritual formation. Thought and knowledge, war and government, production and distribution, labor and service were carefully differentiated functions of society, each assigned to those who were naturally called to it in providing the right means by which they could individually proceed towards their spiritual development and self-perfection. So man was seen in the time of the Gita, in ancient times, when the Gita was written, not as a social, political, and other being, but rather as a spiritual being in process of formation and development. And his social, ethical, um, you know, law, play of temperament, and so on, were seen as means and stages of spiritual formation. And therefore, thought, knowledge, war, and government, all these, labor, production, and distribution and service, were carefully differentiated functions of society. And each were assigned to certain type that fitted with that. That's how the Varna system, what we later call as the caste system, what we say the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras, came into being, but it actually started at its root from this principle. because of the because of the peculiar stress that Indian civilization laid on the individual nature of the person, and not as we do much more to the social type, and to we lump everything together. For us, society is God, social service is God, to do good for others. This is our God today. It was not so in the time that the Gita was written. Okay, so this is important to understand to be able to appreciate the text, and also to be able to see how the historical development of man took place. The modern idea of a common obligation in all the main departments of human activity has its advantages. Now, this is Sri Aurobindo as always. He always looks at both sides of uh, the problem or the question or the issue. The modern idea of a common obligation in all the main departments of human activity has its advantages. It helps to greater solidarity, unity, and fullness in the life of the community, and a more all round development of the complete human being, as opposed to the endless divisions and over specialization and the narrowing and artificial shackling of the life of the individual, to which the Indian system eventually led. The word eventually led is very important because the principle from which it started was certainly a spiritual one and gave a lot of importance to the individual nature and the dharma, the prakriti of each. But then it led to a certain, you know, uh, sorry, yes, it's a certain, it got very, very stagnated and like a crust. And therefore, it led to endless divisions, over specialization, and the narrowing and artificial shackling of the life of the individual, to which the Indian system eventually led. But it has also its disadvantages. And in certain of its developments, the too logical application of it has led to grotesque and disastrous absurdities. This is evident enough in the character of modern war. So, these somewhat are the disadvantages. The, from the idea of a common military obligation binding on every individual to defend and fight for the community by which he lives and profits, has arisen the system by which the whole manhood of the nation is hurled into the bloody trench to slay and be slain. Thinkers, artists, philosophers, priests, merchants, artisans, all torn from their natural functions, the whole life of the community disorganized, reason and conscience overridden, even the minister of religion, who is salaried by the state or called by his function to preach the gospel of peace and love, forced to deny his creed and become a butcher of his fellow men. Not only are conscience and nature violated by the arbitrary fiat of the military state, but national defense, carried to an insane extreme, makes its best attempt to become a national suicide. So here are the disadvantages that happen when you have, a whole state that is militarized and then expects every single person of any bent of nature, whether they are fit for it or not, to go into war and either get slain or be slain. And therefore, this idea of an insane extreme makes its best attempt to become a national suicide. So here, Sri Aurobindo, you know, shows both the downside and the upside of what is now, what we now look at as the modern idea of the common obligation in all the main departments of human activity and man to become, to be there for everything. He's not just the, he becomes a soldier, he becomes the teacher, he becomes the worker, he becomes everything. So I think it's a reference to World War II, where everyone was plunged. That was when he was writing this. And he saw the terrible, terrible agony of those who were really just, told, yes, they had no option. Yeah, had to go, or you'd be shot. So Indian civilization, on the contrary, now here he makes a distinction between the modern idea of a common obligation and all the blah, blah, blah. But he says Indian civilization, on the contrary, made it its chief aim to minimize the incidents and disaster of war. For this purpose, it limited. Now, it's very interesting to note that this idea of the class of kshatriyas or warriors is is deeply entrenched in Indian culture in India, in the whole continent of India or Asia. Maybe I would say Japan had it with the samurai, but it's not very much the European way of seeing life. And this is what he's here saying. Indian civilization, on the contrary, made it its chief aim to minimize the incidents and disaster of war. For this purpose, it limited the military obligation to the small class who, by their birth, nature, and traditions, were marked out for this function and found in it their natural means of self-development through the flowering of the soul in the qualities of courage, disciplined force, strong helpfulness, and chivalrous nobility, for which the warrior's life, pursued under the stress of a high ideal, gives a field and opportunities. So, um, again, the idea here of flowering of the soul in the quality. So, found in their natural means of self-development. So, they were naturally attuned, they were naturally inclined towards this uh, chivalrous, this way of life, of being warriors. The rest of the community was in every way guarded from slaughter and outrage. Their life and occupations were as little interfered with as possible, and the combative and destructive tendencies of human nature were given a restricted field, confined in a sort of lists so as to do the minimum amount of harm to the general life of the race, while at the same time, by being subjected to high ethical ideals and every possible rule of humanity and chivalry, the function of war was obliged to help in ennobling and elevating instead of brutalizing those who performed it. It's very, very, very important. The the Indian civilization and the Indian way was to, through even war, through the function of war, was to help in ennobling, elevating, instead of brutalizing those who performed war. It must be remembered that it is war of this kind and under these conditions that the Gita had in view, war considered as an inevitable part of human life, but so restricted and regulated as to serve like other activities, the ethical and spiritual development, which was then regarded as the whole real object of life. Please mark this. But so even in this war, it must be remembered, it is war of this kind. If you remember, in those who've seen the Mahabharata uh, and also know about it, you know, there were very, very strict rules of conduct in war. That as soon as it was sunset, you had to stop. The conch blew and everyone stopped fighting. Here, what happens? We're in a recent neighborhood. They wait for sunset. When everyone's asleep, they bombard you so that you have no defense. Now, this is not war. This is a brutalization of war. You know, of course, uh, our whole, I mean, over time, we've lost those formats of war that should be there, those principles of war. And then you can even make something as you know, bloody as war, a way of ennobling your character, refining your manhood, and so on. So it must be remembered that it is war of this kind and under these circumstances that the Gita had in view war considered as an inevitable part of human life, but so restricted and regulated as to serve like other activities, the ethical and spiritual development, which was then regarded as the whole real object of life, war destructive within certain carefully fixed limits of the bodily life of individual men, but constructive of their inner life and of the ethical elevation of the race. That war in the past has, when subjected to an ideal, helped in the elevation, as in the development of knighthood and chivalry. You remember the knighthoods, the knights of the Round Table. There was one particular period in Europe where they had that, the samurai in Japan, the Kshatriyas and the warriors of all the Rajputs and so on in India. Maybe there were others too. But you know, this is how that war in the past has been subjected to an ideal, helped in the elevation, but this did not happen in World War II. That war in the past has, when subjected to an ideal, helped in this elevation, as in the development of knighthood and chivalry, the Indian ideal of the Kshatriya, the Japanese ideal of the samurai, can only be denied by the fanatics of passivism. When it has fulfilled its function, it may well disappear. When war has fulfilled its function, it may well disappear. For if it tries to survive its utility, it will appear as an unrelieved brutality of violence, stripped of its ideal and constructive aspects, and will be rejected by the progressive mind of humanity. But its past service to the race must be admitted in any reasonable view of our evolution. Now, the physical fact of war, however, is only a special and outward manifestation of a general principle in life, and the Kshatriya is only the outward manifestation and the type of a general characteristic necessary to the completeness of human perfection. So, um, this physical fact of war is a special outward manifestation of a general principle in life, and the Kshatriya is only the manifestation and type of a general characteristic necessary to the completeness of human perfection. War typifies and embodies physically the aspect of battle and struggle which belongs to all life, both to our inner and our outer being. In a world whose method is a meeting and wrestling of forces, which progress by mutual destruction towards a continually changing adjustment expressive of a progressive harmonizing and a hopeful of a perfect harmony based upon some yet ungrasped potentiality of oneness. The war typifies and embodies the aspect of battle and struggle which belongs to life, the vital, both to our inner life and our outer living. And in a world whose the method of this world, if you see through the ages, the method that nature has employed in the world is a meeting and wrestling of forces which progress by mutual destruction. The progress happens by mutual destruction towards a continually changing adjustment, expressive of a progressive harmonizing and hopeful of a perfect harmony based upon some yet ungrasped potentiality of oneness. The Kshatriya is the type and embodiment of the fighter in man who accepts this principle in life and faces it as a warrior striving towards mastery, not shrinking from the destruction of bodies and forms, but through it all, aiming at the realization of some principle of right, justice, law, which shall be the basis of the harmony towards which the struggle tends. The Gita accepts this aspect of the world energy and the physical fact of war, which embodies it, and it addresses itself to the man of action, the striver and fighter, the Kshatriya, war, which is the extreme contradiction of the soul's high aspiration to peace within and harmlessness without, the striver and fighter, whose necessary turmoil of struggle and action seems to be the very contradiction of the soul's high ideal of calm mastery and self possession, and it seeks for an issue from the contradiction, a point at which its terms meet, and a poise which shall be the first essential basis, harmony and transcendence. Clear? Yes. Man meets the battle of life in the manner most consonant with the essential quality most dominant in his nature. There are, according to the Sankhya philosophy, accepted in this respect by the Gita, three essential qualities or modes of the world energy, and therefore also of human nature. So the three essential quality or modes are sattva, the mode of poise, knowledge, and satisfaction; rajas, the mode of passion, action, and struggling emotion, and tamas, the mode of ignorance and inertia. Dominated by tamas, man does not so much meet the rush and shock of the world energies whirling about him and converging upon him as he succumbs to them, is overborne by them, afflicted, subjected, or at the most helped by the other qualities. The tamasic man seeks only somehow to survive, subsist, so long as he may, to shelter himself in the fortress of an established routine of thought and action, in which he feels himself to a certain extent protected from the battle, able to reject the demand which his higher nature makes upon him, excused from from accepting the necessity of further struggle and the ideal of an increasing effort and mastery. So here, man meets the battle of life. We all meet the battle of life. You see, this is the human. Now he's talking about it in generality, human nature, right? And how the modes of being uh, which are dominant in each of us. Some of us are dominated by sattva. Some of us are dominated by tamas. Some of us are dominated by rajas. Some of us are, a mixture. So he says here, each of us meets the battle of life, and humanity and a man, by and large, meets it according to the essential quality most dominant in his nature. Now he goes back here to the Sankhya philosophy, which defines and states that there are three essential qualities that are uh, the modes of the and therefore of human nature, modes of the world voice, sorry, modes of the world's energy, and therefore also of human nature. What are the three essential qualities? Rajas, tamas, and sattva. So his first starts tamas. If you are dominated by tamas, this is how you will respond and act to aggression, to battle, to war, to destruction. You will do the following. Dominated by tamas, man does not so much meet the rush and shock of the world energies. He doesn't rise above them. He tends to either succumb to them or is overborne by them, afflicted, subjected, or then the tamasic man seeks somehow to survive, to subsist so long as he may, to shelter himself in the fortress of an established routine of thought and action, in which he feels himself to a certain extent protected from the battle, able to reject the demand which his higher nature makes upon him, excused from accepting the necessity of further struggle, and the ideal of an increasing effort and mastery. Now, dominated by Rajas, what does man do? Man flings himself into the battle and attempts to use the struggle of forces for his own egoistic benefit, to slay, to conquer, dominate, enjoy, or helped by a certain measure of the sattvic quality, the rajasic man makes the struggle itself a means of increasing inner mastery, joy, power, possession. So he might be totally rajasic, which is then he completely loses, becomes an ego issue from it, or he might have the qualities of the sattvic nature also mixed with his rajasic uh, movement. And then he changes it into the next part, which is he makes the struggle itself a means of increasing inner mastery, joy, power, possession. The battle of life becomes his delight and passion, partly for its own sake, for the pleasure of the activity and the sense of power, partly as a means of his increase in natural self-development. So this is very important. Now, when here he is talking about how does man meet the battle of life, he's talking about battle of life in general. How do we, how does each one of us meet the battle of life? Because the battle of life doesn't only happen at a particular time in a particular, field. It happens, the life battle continues. It happens at all moments when we are under duress and we are attacked or we are under some sort of stress. So this is the way the Rajasic man does. And now he goes to, if you are dominated by Sattva, the Sattvic quality, man seeks in the midst of the strife for a principle of law, right, poise, harmony, peace, satisfaction. The purely Sattvic man tends to seek this within, whether for himself alone or with an impulse to communicate it when one to other human minds, but usually by a sort of inner detachment from or else an outer rejection of the strife and turmoil of the active world energy. But if the Sattvic mind accepts partly the Rajasic principle impulse, it seeks rather to impose this poise and harmony upon the struggle and apparent um, struggle and apparent yes, an apparent chaos to vindicate a victory for peace, love, and harmony over the principle of war, discord, and struggle. So this to vindicate a victory for peace, love, and harmony over the principle of war, discord, and struggle. All the attitudes adopted by the human mind towards the problem of life either derive from the domination of one or the other of these qualities. Very important to know because this is the psychology of the self, which one will, and each of us need to find out in situations which of these qualities are more dominant and come out in us, so that we can begin to direct these and become a master of these. So all the attitudes adopted by the human mind towards the problem of life derive from the domination of one or other of these qualities, or else from an attempt at balance and harmony between them. So either an attempt at balance and harmony between the three qualities of tamas, rajas, and sattva, or a domination of one or over the other. But there comes also a stage in which the mind recoils from the whole problem and dissatisfied with the solutions given by the threefold mode of nature, Traigunya seeks for some higher solution outside of it, or else above it. It looks for an escape in either into something which is outside and void of all qualities, and therefore of all activity, or in something which is superior to the three qualities and master of them, and therefore at once capable of action and unaffected, undominated by its own action. In the nirguna, or the three guna titta, it aspires to an absolute peace, an unconditioned existence, or a dominant calm and superior existence. The natural movement of the former attitude is towards the renunciation of the world, sannyas, of the latter towards the superiority to the claims of the lower nature and its whirl of actions and reactions, and its principle is equality and the inner renunciation of passion and desire. It is the latter, the inner renunciation of the equality and the inner renunciation of passion and desire that the Gita firmly bases itself on, and what it talks about samatha, the importance of developing equality of nature, equanimity, equality, and so on. Many shlokas we will read later, which are beautiful, which describe this. So the natural movement of the former attitude is towards renunciation of the world, sannyasa. Of the latter towards superiority to the claims of the lower nature. And its principle is equality and the inner renunciation of passion and desire. The former is the first impulse of Arjuna, recoiling from the calamitous culmination of all his heroic activity in the great cataclysm of battle and massacre, Kurukshetra, losing his whole past principle of action inaction, and the rejection of life and its claims seem to be seem to him the only issues. The first was what we started with, the dejection of Arjuna. When he refuses to act, he says, inaction and rejection, I'm going to reject this, I'm walking away from it, I don't want this, I don't want to fight, I don't want the kingdom. So this was his first recoil. Former principle of sannyasa, which he talks about, where you recoil and walk away and escape either to something which is outside and void of all qualities and so on and so forth, was Arjuna's first reaction. But it is to an inner superiority and not to the physical renunciation of life and action that he is called by the voice of the divine teacher. So it is to the inner superiority and not to the physical renunciation of life and action that he is called by the voice of the divine teacher. Arjuna is the Kshatriya, the Rajasic man, who governs his Rajasic action by a high sattvic ideal. He advances to this gigantic struggle, to this Kurukshetra, with the full acceptance of the joy of battle as to a holiday of fight, but with a proud confidence and in the righteousness of his cause. He advances in his rapid chariot, tearing the hearts of his enemies with the victorious clamor of his war conch. For he wishes to look upon all these kings of men who have come here to champion against him the cause of unrighteousness and establish the rule of life, the disregard of law, justice, and truth, which they would replace by the rule of selfish and arrogant egoism. When this confidence is shattered within him, when he is smitten down from his customary attitude and mental basis of life, it is by the uprush of the tamasic quality into the rajasic man, inducing a recoil of astonishment, grief, horror, dismay, dejection, bewilderment of the mind, and the war of reason against itself, a collapse towards the principle of ignorance and inertia. As a result, he turns towards renunciation. Better, he says, and this is the exact translation of a shloka, better the life of the mendicant living upon alms than this dharma of the Kshatriya, this battle in action culminating in undiscriminating massacre, this principle of mastery and glory and power, which can only be won by destruction and bloodshed, this conquest of blood-stained enjoyments, this vindication of justice and right by a means which contradicts all righteousness, and this affirmation of the social law by a war which destroys in its process and results all that constitutes society. Sannyasa is the renunciation of life and action and of the threefold modes of nature. So, what is sannyasa? It's the renunciation of life and action and of the threefold modes of nature. But it has to be approached through one or other of the three qualities. The impulse may be tamasic, a feeling of impotence, fear, aversion, disgust, horror of the world and life, or it may be rajasic, or it may be the rajasic quality tending towards tamas, an impulse of weariness of the struggle, grief, disappointment, refusal to accept any longer this vain turmoil of activity with its pains and its eternal discontent, or the impulse may be that of rajas, tending towards sattva, the impulse to arrive at something superior to anything life can give, to conquer a higher state, to trample down life itself under the feet of an inner strength which seeks to break all bonds and transcend all limits. or it may be sattvic, an intellectual perception of the vanity of life and the absence of any real goal or justification for this ever cycling world existence, or else a spiritual perception of the timeless, the infinite, the silent, the nameless, and formless peace beyond. The recoil of Arjuna is the tamasic recoil from action of the sattva rajasic man. The teacher may confirm it in its direction, using it as a dark entry to the purity and peace of the ascetic life. Or he may purify it at once and raise it towards the rare altitudes of the sattvic tendency of renunciation. In fact, he does neither. He discourages the tamasic recoil and the tendency to renunciation and enjoins the continuance of action and even of the same fierce and terrible action. But he points the disciple towards another and inner renunciation, which is the real issue from which his crisis and the way towards the soul's superiority to the world nature, and yet its calm and self-possessed action in the world. Not a physical asceticism, but an inner ascesis is the teaching of the Gita. So we end here the chapter on the battle of life. And we have a few minutes for questions or comments or reflections. Would anyone like to? Yes?
And the problem with founders, I think that is almost we are getting towards
Yes.
but in such a way, we have we just get to community that also leads to that harm.
Yes.
And how do we identify whether it's driven by or sense of equality and balance or unreasonable
So so just rephrase your question.
personal basis, some situations where it's either exuding with respect to not looking at anything or self. I could be doing no action and still be calm, right? Because I'm not taking any action, I'm not entering feedback
Yeah.
to any question.
Yeah.
The second is I can observe everything and I take action, but I'm not affected by the something that we work.
So what is your question?
Understand. Question is that Tamas and Sattva look very similar. Yes, they are
Different, yes. Yes. So how do you differentiate between that, between the two?
I could do a case where in either or I'm still calm, as well as if I see that definitely I am still calm. Right? But it's not easy to find exactly something. I'm not taking action. Whereas if I push myself, take action and be with that.
Yeah.
That is the right way.
That's right. That's right. So to take action, that's what Sri Krishna is saying, that the escape is not an option. Getting into tamasic mode or is not an option. Uh, to take action, but to do it with equanimity, equality of consciousness, and an inner renunciation of desire, inner renunciation of anger, inner renunciation of egoism and ambition is what he's going towards. It's a very difficult thing. So, I mean, it's easy to say it, but it is, that is the yoga of the Gita. And that's why the Gita is a text for the yoga. The ego comes in, yeah. So therefore, then for that, he says that you surrender to me, remember and offer me, call me. So these are the ways that you can sublimate and overcome the ego in action. Yes. Any other questions?
the main reason is being interesting. I think our duty towards society was very well defined.
Yes. So
But
that
now is not the
no.
kind of modern man that is not so well defined.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They
And
want.
also then it becomes always a question that you want to do it because now you may have a choice. You kind of wonder now you don't have a choice. You have to fight that.
No, he had a choice. He could have walked out. He also had the choice. He could have said, "I won't fight."
Very uh,
No, they.
yeah, it was duty also to protect.
It was certainly his duty, but people, when they had still had a choice. He had a choice. You can't say he didn't have a choice. He did have a choice. He was trying to actually walk away, and Sri Krishna stopped him, saying, "Hello, buddy, you're not going anywhere. Stay here." He was ready to give up the kingdom. Say, "No, let them take it over. They want to let them, but why? How can I massacre everybody?" He had a choice, but the fact is, though, that what Sri Aurobindo said in the first part was that it was divided into certain uh, trades and professions and so on, depending on the individual nature of the man. It didn't mean that it was so rigid that he did not have a choice and he had to fulfill that duty only. That became much, much later. But at the time of the Gita, that was not there. Okay. Any other? Okay. So we'll end here. We'll start with the meditation.